Hi, how are you? My name is Diego Moldes, and I'm a writer based in Madrid, though I'm originally from Galicia in northwestern Spain, and I'm the author of 15 published books. I'm here to talk with you about one of them, which has been translated into English by Stephen Capsuto in New York. The title is When Einstein Met Kafka, Jewish Contributions to the Modern World.
And I'm Stephen Capsuto. I translated this incredibly big book from Spanish into English. And as we're recording this, Diego and I are each speaking in our own language, and you will see Diego magically dubbed into English through artificial intelligence. When I was translating the sections of the book dealing with science and inventions, one of the things that struck me was that Jews are only 0.2% of the world's population, and other than Israel, no more than about 2.5% of any country in the world. And yet Jews have made such disproportionately huge contributions to medicine, science, biology, chemistry, things that really changed our lives. And why do you think that is?
Well, the answer, as with almost everything in the book, Stephen, lies in education. I explain in the book that the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, changed the West radically. And one of the great Jewish philosophers of the Enlightenment, Moses Mendelssohn, wrote that when Jews were finally admitted into universities, one thing that differentiated them from their Christian colleagues was that their study of nature was not hindered by religious conflicts. And that difference led to a whole range of discoveries. This matters because Judaism, unlike Christianity, is not a revealed religion that revolves around a prophet who's the Son of God. In Christianity, that belief created a crisis between reason and faith, which is why the Enlightenment is also called the Age of Reason. No such contradiction exists in Judaism, because, as Mendelssohn explained back in 1783, way back then, even before the French Revolution, and at the time when the United States was being founded, Mendelssohn explained that the only natural, physical, real revelation that the Jewish people believe in is the Ten Commandments, the tablets that God gave to Moses in the Sinai Peninsula. After explaining this, I lay out a theory, an explanation of why Jews had not previously played a major role in science. In ancient times, of course, science was largely Greek and then Roman, and in the Middle Ages, it was basically in the hands of the church. But over the course of the 19th century, generations of emancipated secular Jews gradually gained access to universities. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, we see these Jewish scientists transforming not only the Jewish world and not only science, but the world in general, with a series of discoveries that completely changed human history. And I start that discussion, of course, with one of the two people whose names appear in the title of this book, Albert Einstein.
One of the impressions I got while translating the book, and of course reading the book, because you can't translate without reading it, is that there were all those centuries when Jews were barred by law from the universities. They couldn't practice entire professions. And then there's that point starting around the beginning of the 19th century where, as you said, the emancipation happens, and suddenly they can go to the university and they can be in science and law and all these fields. And I just kind of got this feeling that they probably felt that because there was still a lot of prejudice against them, they had to work harder and longer than everyone else to be considered even half as good. And that maybe that determination was part of why, because you look at lists of who has won the Nobel Prize in sciences over the years, and a huge percentage are Jewish. And I wonder if that was part of it, that feeling that you had to work harder and better to be considered as good.
Yes, that's a very good question. I think there is an educational component, as I mentioned, which initially has to do with literacy. I mentioned in the book, if you remember, Stephen, that around the year 1500, more or less the same era as the rise of the printing press, about 50% of the medical doctors in Europe were Jewish, even though Jews made up only 1% of the European population. In the Americas, there were no Jews yet. They arrived in North America in the 17th and 18th centuries. But what's curious is that in Europe, these legally emancipated Jewish men, who often changed their last name specifically so they wouldn't be singled out as Jews in the universities, and who adopted names that sounded German or French or Russian, felt almost morally obligated to say, well, I didn't go into my family business and I also didn't go the route of the yeshiva, and I didn't become a rabbi, but I decided to follow the path of the Gentiles, the non-Jews. So I have a responsibility because I'm the first person in my family to go to university or to go to law school. And sometimes they had to convert, right? There are examples like Hein and like Marx, as you know, who studied law and whose father converted to Christianity in order to be permitted to practice that profession. But there are countless cases like that. And in the sciences, I think it has to do with what you said, that very strong entrenched anti-Semitism in 19th century Europe and also in the United States, I have to say, and Canada. But that's why they needed that work ethic, that determination to excel. And in all of the so-called empirical sciences or pure sciences, they made absolutely transformative contributions. Again, not only changing the history of physics, but also of chemistry and biology and so on. In the book, I give examples from mathematics, I don't know if you remember, and in inventions of all kinds. And it's quite surprising. There are so many that even I can't remember all the names. When I was preparing for interviews and looking over your translations, I had to reread this book, which I'd written over the course of the first 2 decades of the 21st century, from 2000 to 2019. And I realized I had forgotten some names, and I kept saying, wow, that's yet another invention or discovery that originated with Jews. Today, for example, while reviewing the text, I rediscovered that the first scientists who identified HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, and also hepatitis B and the retroviral treatments, in both cases were Jewish men and women. And incidentally, Stephen, the number of Jewish women in the sciences is really striking. Now, I don't mean today, because nowadays there's almost gender parity in the sciences with even more women than men at many universities. But I'm talking about the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, the interwar period and the immediate post-war years. And for that era, the numbers are truly remarkable.
I was talking to a group at a JCC a couple of weeks ago about this book, and they were struck by the fact that not only wildly scientific, complicated inventions were invented by Jews, but so many everyday things like shopping carts, mass-produced ballpoint pens. Last week, I think you mentioned the first mass-producible latex condoms. I mean, it's like just a weird mix of things in addition to, yes, the theory of relativity and things on that level.
There are, of course, more recent examples, such as the invention of the USB thumb drive. Also, for instance, the remote control for televisions was developed by a Jewish inventor from Vienna. The book also explores many very curious cases, some of which you mentioned, including shopping carts for supermarkets, which are actually quite old. If I remember right, they were patented in 1937.
Yeah, around then.
Although in Europe, the whole concept of a supermarket that you go through with a cart picking up products is something I don't think we had until the 1960s. But then there are also some very surprising things. For example, you mentioned the case of two coincidental parallel inventions. A Polish Jew in Germany and a Jew in New Jersey, also of European origin, developed mass-produced condoms at the same time, independently of each other. And in spite of the similarities and the coincidental timing, the two inventors did not know each other. These inventions and the use of condoms changed birth rates by curbing the population explosion that had begun before World War I and which continued during the interwar years after the huge number of deaths during the Great War. But also, if you remember, it was Gregory Pincus, a child of European Jewish immigrants to the United States, who invented the birth control pill, putting women in charge of the decision. And the feminist revolution of the 1960s emerged in part from the availability of birth control pills, starting in the 1950s in the US and a bit later in Europe, because now women could decide whether or not to have children, especially women who worked outside the home, who were part of the workforce. And I think that both the modern latex condom and the birth control pill marked a tipping point in helping to define sexuality over the past 70 or 80 years.
Since we're using artificial intelligence to W today, why don't we talk a little bit about the role of Jewish inventors and entrepreneurs in the rise of artificial intelligence?
Yes, well, it's really curious because when I wrote the book, if you remember, ChatGPT did not exist yet, right? But when I was revising the postscript, we added its president and its CEO, Brockman and Altman, right? Sam Altman and Brockman. Both are Jewish, which I hadn't known when I wrote the book. So we've put them into the English edition. But if I may, I have the original Spanish edition here. And I start by explaining that cybernetics is a term coined and developed by Norbert Wiener, a mathematician and philosopher who was one of the early pioneers at MIT. The concept of cybernetics first appeared in a 1948 book, but there are other important figures such as Raymond Kurzweil or, for instance, Saul Amaril, a Greek Jew who worked on artificial intelligence at the Pentagon in the United States and made major advances in that field. Also, Joseph Wiesenbaum, who fled from Hitler with his parents and became a prominent mathematician in the US. And then, of course, there are those who contributed to what we now call artificial intelligence. All from MIT, as you know, Stephen, there's Herbert Alexander Simon, Marvin Lee Minsky, Edward Albert Feigenbaum, and so on. It's a lot of names, but all of them contributed to the field of AI. Of course, right now, there are many non-Jewish engineers working in AI from many backgrounds, ethnicities, nationalities, and religions. But notably, once again, when the development of artificial intelligence first began, a large portion of the scientists were Jewish. And again, they were either Jewish immigrants to the United States or children of those immigrants. So this continues a trend that, as I mentioned before, was already present in physics, physiology, and medicine, organic and inorganic chemistry, and in mathematics.
And since we're talking about scientists who came from Europe, who were Jewish and came to the US and to elsewhere in the Americas, I suppose you can't discuss Jewish scientists in the 20th century without discussing the brain drains, where large numbers of scientists, many of them Jewish, came first from the Russian Empire and Central and Eastern Europe, and then as you move further into the 20th century, from Germany and Poland and other places that were deeply affected by the Holocaust. Ironically, now we have the reverse. The US benefited from that all through the 20th century, and now scientists are fleeing the US to go to places where there's better funding. But throughout the late 19th century and well into the 20th century, there was this brain drain happening. Could you talk a little about that and the motives behind it?
Perhaps the importance of this topic, the brain drain from Europe to the United States, which happened in several phases and involved various waves of migrants, of exiles in many cases, or of refugees, is that it didn't just change the history of science. From my perspective, it changed the history of the world. The global focus shifted or pivoted from Europe to North America during the Second World War, somewhat already in the 1930s, but especially during the war. It's true that the United States was already the world's leading economic power during the time of Theodore Roosevelt. If you recall, around the turn of the 20th century, it had already surpassed the United Kingdom as the top industrial and economic power. But that doesn't mean they held scientific leadership. Scientific leadership was still in Europe and specifically in the German-speaking countries, which includes not only what we now call Germany. As you know, it also included other German-speaking areas in Austria, in Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, some regions of Poland that were then Prussia, as well as in Switzerland and parts of the Netherlands and so on. It wasn't just what we now understand as Germany. Those German-speaking Jewish communities, which no longer spoke Yiddish, as you know, that was the cradle of those minds that would transform humanity. Einstein is one example, but there are many, many others. For instance, the movie Oppenheimer, if you remember, by the British filmmaker Christopher Nolan, tells the opposite story. How Oppenheimer, who is American, the son of immigrants but still American, has to go to Europe, talks with Niels Bohr and other scientists, many of whom are also Jewish, and brings them to the United States for the Manhattan Project. But it's he who goes from the United States to Europe to see the state of the physical sciences in Germany. Now, the brain drain occurs in several phases. There's a first wave that predates Hitler, in the period up to, let's say, 1933. Then there's one from 1933 to, I wouldn't say 1945, because really those who didn't leave before the early 1940s, sometimes via France or Lisbon or the United Kingdom, well, unfortunately, those people perished in the Holocaust. But that flood of scientists and academics into American universities and research centers, right? Like Einstein at Princeton? Well, there are hundreds of examples. I think that's what gave the United States the leadership it maintained for 80 years, or practically 90 years, I would say, because even before the Second World War, they already had that scientific and technological leadership, and therefore also military leadership, which, by the way, is now in crisis, precisely because there is no longer a renewal of talent there. And now, as you know, innovation is shifting toward the other great ancient people who have survived, much more numerous than the Jewish people, namely the Chinese. But of course, I also believe that the brain drain has a financial component I haven't mentioned yet. Generally, the best and brightest will go where they are paid more, and where they can conduct their research with a sense of security. Legal security, yes, but also the reasonable expectation of long-term funding. Back then, the United States, the empire of the dollar, if you'll pardon the expression, gave them the peace of mind to carry out projects over the course of 10, 20, or even 50 years. For a scientist, that's very important, to have that financial stability and philanthropic support behind them. So here is the English edition of When Einstein Met Kafka. To write this book, I had to read a lot of other books, hundreds of them. And the best way for you to learn from the writers that I learned from is to buy this book in the US or on Amazon, in bookstores, wherever you can find it, and discover Stephen's excellent translation. I think your translation is fantastic. But I'd also like people to understand that a book is not just a book. Walt Whitman said that whoever touches a book touches a man, because they touch the soul of the person who wrote it. And in my case, I think what I've tried to do is act a bit like a sponge and gather all that research and, in a very concise way, convey it to a wide audience. It's not a book for specialists, it's for a broad, knowledgeable general readership. And as you know, Stephen, the section on science is not the most extensive part of the book because I'm not a scientist. I'm rooted more in the humanities. But while I was writing the exploration of specific fields, it seemed important to start with the empirical sciences. And well, as I said, there are plenty of examples and people are going to be surprised.